Hello, I'm Richard Murphy. I'm Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University in England. But today, and much more relevantly, I'm here as a columnist on The National to have a discussion with Ross Greer from the Scottish Greens. What about green economic policy for Scotland? That's the subject of our debate. This is one of a number of these interviews that I'm doing with leading political thinkers and members of parties in Scotland. And welcome, Ross.
Hi there, Richard. Thanks for having me.
That's all right. We're pleased to see you. We need all the balance we can get, and we are talking to all the pro-independence parties. So you're clearly on that spectrum. I'm asking everybody, broadly speaking, the same opening question. Where do you see us as being economically at this moment?
I think Scotland suffers from a lot of the same massive structural problems in our economy that the UK does as a whole, but we should start any discussion about our economy talking up the strengths, though. Scotland has done remarkably well compared to the rest of the UK outside London and the southeast on a range of measures. So, for example, this is the strongest part of the UK outside of London, the southeast, for foreign direct investment. Now, I've got some issues with that we might touch on later on, but it's a demonstration of the fact that Scotland is seen as an attractive place to invest, to do business, to take part in the economy. We've got sectors like the film and TV industry that I'm familiar with that 10 years ago was really struggling, primarily because of a lack of government support, but is now absolutely thriving. We're at the point where studios across Scotland are fully booked and turning away business. Our video game industry is doing well. In 2021 alone, we went from about 27,000 jobs in renewable energy to about 42,000, so a 50% growth rate in a single year. So there are massive advantages, massive strengths in our economy, like the university sector is driving a lot of that. But we suffer from the same problems the UK as a whole does, and some of them are more acute in Scotland because of UK government policy. So real problems with labour shortages, not having enough workers, not having enough people skilled in the right areas. And a huge part of that is because of Brexit and UK government economic policy. We've got a relatively low wage economy. It's outrageous that the vast majority of children in Scotland and across the UK who live in poverty are in working households. They're not in poverty because the adults in their households don't have a job. They're in poverty because people are being paid poverty wages by their employers. So we've got a low wage and a low productivity economy as well. So there are massive structural challenges that we need to face up to. I always think, though, it's worth starting off those conversations by being really clear about the strengths that Scotland's economy has, because I don't think we talk about those enough.
Well, I like that. We'll have to have another discussion when it comes to Jers time and what that says about the strength of the Scottish economy. But that's not for today. All of what I might describe as the English parties in this election, in particular, the Tories, the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, and they're going to be offended by me calling them that, and I don't care. They will all tell us that there is no money left. Do you agree?
That is a myth, and it's actually quite an offensive myth, because usually political parties will say that, certainly in the context of a UK election. It's different in the context of a Scottish election where we have fewer powers, not no powers, but fewer options to generate more money. But in the context of a UK election, the starting point should be that this is one of the wealthiest countries in the history of the planet. There is a vast, vast amount of money in this country. The problem is it's incredibly unequally held. A really, really, really small percentage of our population hoard a huge amount of that wealth. And when political parties say there's no money left, what they're saying is they're just not willing to go and get that money from the people who've hoarded it, the people who've got rich while everybody else has struggled. So the classic example.
What would you? Well, I'm obviously going to ask you the next question. Fine, you think there's lots of people hoarding money. The UK has supposed financial wealth of £15 trillion, which is 6 times the UK's supposed national annual income. How would you go and get it? What would you want to do?
So one area that would be massive, which you are a real specialist in, Richard, is about cracking down on tax avoidance and the offshoring of wealth. A huge amount of wealth that's generated in the UK disappears out of the country because a small number of people are able to set up their tax arrangements in that way. But one thing, before even getting to that element of it, which I think opens up a much wider discussion, one thing that really outrages me about what the Labour Party are saying at the moment, because they're actively using this no magic money tree line. You know, they're tweeting a graphic of a money tree saying there's no magic money tree. They're making a choice. If the UK Labour Party replicated the progressive income tax system that we have here in Scotland across the rest of the UK. So that's a tax system delivered by the Greens. All the changes that have been made since it was devolved were tabled by the Greens, either in opposition when we negotiated the budgets or during our time in government. If our income tax system was replicated across the UK, that would generate more than £11 billion of additional income. And for Scotland, what we've seen since we started making those changes is overall tax revenue is up and inward migration to Scotland from the rest of the UK is up. So it's not been that off-putting factor that they claim. So when the Labour Party say, for example, that they can't commit to abolish the 2-child cap on child benefit because there's no magic money tree, what they're saying is that they've made the choice not to do that. That's 250,000 children across the UK are held in poverty because of that. And if they replicated our income tax system in the rest of the UK, they would have enough money to abolish the 2-child cap about 7 times over. So the idea there's no magic money tree is nonsense. And the people claiming it, like Rachel Reeves, are absolutely smart enough to know it's nonsense. So what they're doing is lying to the public. They are just not willing to make progressive changes, whether it's small stuff like those income tax changes, because it makes a relatively small difference for most people. You know, most people in Scotland pay less tax than they would in the rest of the UK. Those that pay more pay a little bit more, apart from those at the top. Or you could go for the really, really big changes, like cracking down on tax avoidance, on properly taxing wealth, not just income. And you're talking tens of billions of pounds from those kind of changes, transformational amounts of money.
Okay, and I hear what you say there. But let's be realistic. Whatever happens on the 4th July, there are not going to be large numbers of Greens at Westminster. There may be some. I know that the Greens in England, and I stress that I'm very well aware that the Greens in England are not the same as the Greens in Scotland. They are independent parties from each other, although with some overlaps in agendas, but not entirely. But what would you be seeking to do at Westminster to change the position if you get Green MPs from Scotland sitting in the chamber in Westminster?
So there's a whole range of options. And the first options, the kind of low-hanging fruit, are about closing the loopholes in the current system. So there's the big substantive changes we could make. So we're proposing UK-wide a wealth tax in Scotland, replacing council tax with land value tax. That's devolved, but I think it's worth talking about in the context of how we tackle wealth inequality in this country. But the low-hanging fruit is simply closing all the loopholes in the current system. So if you take the windfall tax that exists for oil and gas company profits, now for a start, we would expand the windfall tax to all large companies making excessive profits, not just oil and gas. But for oil and gas, we would say, you know, this isn't a windfall tax as in a one-off, and we should be permanently taxing the companies who are making huge profits, destroying the planet, and reinvesting that money into tackling the crisis. First thing you can do there is end the 90% loophole. So there is a loophole that allows oil and gas companies to only pay a fraction of the windfall tax if they commit to drilling for more oil and gas. Like absolute madness. If they commit to furthering the climate crisis, making it worse, they get a massive tax break. So one of the first things we could do is end that loophole, and we'd suddenly be generating many times the amount the windfall tax currently is. So those kind of low-hanging fruit options.
To achieve these goals, I mean, I like the goals. You won't be surprised about that. I share a lot of them, clearly. I've written on these areas, so that's not going to be news to anybody on the national, that there is some similarity on our views on closing tax loopholes. But how would you actually go about this in Westminster? Who would you work with, for example? Do you see natural alliances? Because those who are going to be voting Green in Scotland are going to want to know, who are you going to work with to achieve outcomes for the people of Scotland in Westminster?
So depending on the issue, the alliances are slightly different. So despite the best efforts of the Labour Party leadership, there is still a left within the Labour Party. It will, unfortunately, clearly elect fewer MPs, certainly as a proportion of the Labour group after the next election, after all the purging that Keir Starmer's people have done. But there are good left-wing people on the Labour benches who we can work with on these kind of issues. On some issues, we can absolutely find common ground with the SNP's MPs. So on that example, the windfall tax on oil and gas companies, probably not. They've taken a much more, a cooler position, you might say. I would say not a brave enough position on windfall tax on oil and gas. But on things like closing tax avoidance loopholes, absolutely. It's SNP MPs, MPs from the left of the Labour Party. But it's also about building extra parliamentary alliances outside of Parliament, because with the best will in the world, we can all see the opinion polls. We can all see that Labour are heading for a huge majority, and that Keir Starmer has selected candidates to make sure that even within that majority, he has a huge number of loyalists to him, rather than more independently minded people who would actually push for socialism. So that's what's going to make movement building outside of Parliament really important. And the windfall tax is actually a great example of that. A Tory government has been forced to bring in a windfall tax on oil and gas companies, albeit a deeply flawed one, but there was no way they were going to bring that in of their own free will. It was because of a huge amount of pressure that was put on them by not just the climate movement, but by people who were campaigning on the cost of living as well, which is why bringing together our movements for people and planet is so important. And that's what's going to be key. What we can do inside Westminster, in the House of Commons, is going to be really, really limited with a massive single party majority for a really undemocratic and frankly centre-right party. So Green MPs at Westminster, yeah, they'll work with other MPs who we can share agreement on an issue-by-issue basis with. But the key thing will be working with the wider movement, working with trade unions, with the climate movement, working with people who are campaigning for social and economic justice, because that external pressure, that's much more likely to get results. The key thing is you do need a couple of people inside Parliament to be part of that pressure.
You've raised the issue of oil and gas earlier than I planned in this interview, but it was going to come up. So let's let it come up and let's talk about it, because it seems to me that this is one of the big issues in the current debate between the pro-independence parties. And you've already hinted at that. Where are you? Why are you where you are? Why don't you think the other parties are plausible on this issue and that you are?
So it shouldn't really surprise anybody where the Greens are on this issue. You know, we are very clear that every party's policies should be rooted in the science of the climate crisis. And the science is absolutely clear. The IPCC, the UN's climate scientist panel, the International Energy Agency, all of the international authorities on this could not be clearer that we cannot afford more oil and gas. We can't afford to be drilling for more, opening new fields. We need to be phasing away from fossil fuels even quicker than we already are. So we find this idea that the SNP are pushing of case-by-case climate compatibility tests on oil and gas fields really quite confusing, because I can't understand a situation where one oil field could pass a climate test, but another one couldn't, because ultimately they would be failing for the same reasons. And the reason is very simple. We cannot afford to burn more oil and gas. The climate crisis is already happening. We can already see it happening around us, but we are about 5 years off the tipping point where it can't be stopped anymore, where the feedback loops have become essentially complete. And at that point, we can mitigate some of the damage, but we can't stop runaway climate breakdown. So the Greens are absolutely clear, say, we need to massively speed up the transition. So obviously no more new oil and gas fields, because you're not transitioning away from what's destroying the planet if you're opening new fields. And we use the money that we'd be taxing to get from the oil and gas giants who've made huge, obscene profits in recent years, use that money to invest in the transition to renewables, and also to things like home energy insulation, because we don't just need green energy, we need to reduce the amount of energy that we're consuming, because that both reduces your household energy bills and the amount of whatever source of energy it is you need. You know, the likes of BP, Shell, etc., they're making vast profits internationally, but also with their UK operations, and most of that is in Scottish territorial waters. So for the Greens, it's dead simple. Absolutely no new oil and gas fields. properly tax these companies, so not just a one-off windfall tax with the loophole that I've already mentioned, but a permanent tax, no loophole. Use the billions of pounds you'd be generating from that to really boost the transition to renewables. I've already mentioned that we went from 27,000 to 42,000 jobs in the renewable energy industry in just 1 year, 2021. So that transition is happening, but not quick enough for people working in the oil and gas sector. So we need to speed that up and use that money on the kind of things like a massive home energy insulation package, moving to heat pumps, things like that, that will also help people through the cost of living crisis.
One very particular question: how do you help Aberdeen? Because clearly it's going to have a difficulty with that problem.
Absolutely. And that's why, when we went into the Scottish Government in 2021, one of the points in that programme, the Butte House Agreement, was a just transition fund for the North East and Moray, recognising that that's the region that will be by far the most affected economically, directly affected. Obviously, climate breakdown affects the whole world and our entire economy, every sector of it, but most obviously indirectly in Aberdeen, the Shire and the wider North East. So that was a £500 million fund. And we had started to distribute money from the Just Transition Fund. So, for example, the campaign for North East Rail that the Scottish Greens support, about doing exactly what it says on the tin, opening lines there, new stations, connecting towns in the North East that don't currently have rail links. We used the Just Transition Fund to get the business case done for that, the feasibility case for expanding the rail line up there. So lots of local projects. Bit of tension between ourselves and the SNP on the kind of projects that should have got Just Transition funding. So Ian Wood, the billionaire from the oil and gas industry, some of Ian Wood's projects were getting funding, and the Greens don't think that's the best use of the Just Transition Fund. The SNP would argue that it is. But the key thing is, we certainly, as the Greens, were absolutely committed to making sure that the just transition happens across Scotland and obviously across the world, but that the North East has particular attention paid to it, especially when you're talking about taxing oil and gas companies. Given the disposition of those companies within the Scottish economy, it is only fair that the money used from that goes disproportionately to the North East. That being said, we do need to make the point that the just transition allows us to reindustrialise and to bring really high-skilled jobs across the country. So in my region in the west of Scotland, at Hunterston, we've got a nuclear power station that's decommissioning, but right beside it, we've got a former coal terminal that a company have just got planning consent in principle to build a factory for undersea cable manufacturing on. And that's primarily going to be for offshore wind and for the European interconnectors that we need. So that's a great example of the just transition. And that's in an area like Ayrshire that was devastated by deindustrialization in the 70s and the 80s, and is now going through a difficult process where jobs are being lost at the nuclear power station. But we're creating those jobs in that new green economy in places like that as well.
Let's go back to what could happen at Westminster, because let's be realistic, there's very little chance in the next Parliament of anyone getting through a Section 30 agreement. There's nobody going to agree to an independence referendum, I suspect. But let's talk about what could be negotiated, and that's the devolution settlement. Now, you've mentioned tax a lot, and you will never upset me by mentioning tax a lot, because that's my sort of living and breathing existence. But if we go back and talk about the devolution settlement, what extra taxing powers would the Greens want for Scotland, and how would they use them?
So the first thing for us on tax would be a kind of meta power. So not devolving a specific tax, but devolving the power to create new national taxes in Scotland, because the only power that we have in that area at the moment is to create new local taxes, which is great. The Greens want more local taxation. Local government should be able to properly govern. So we've just delivered the visitor levy. So that's just been passed in Parliament. That was based on a budget deal between the Greens and the SNP a couple of years ago. So that's an example of a local tax. But there are taxes that we would want to bring in nationally in Scotland. And at the moment, if you want to do anything in Scotland, you either have to create a local tax, and even then it cannot replicate an existing national UK-wide tax, or the UK government will basically veto it. Or if you want to create a new national tax, you can create it, but you then need to ask Treasury and the UK government for permission, and they'll obviously say no. So we would want to devolve the power to create taxes for ourselves and not need Treasury and UK government permission to do that. Tax is only one part of the financial story. The other part of it is about borrowing powers, because the Scottish
Can I come
government...
back to, before you go to borrowing powers, and I agree they're important, but I did ask you specifically what, because you'd like that power, but let's be honest, I don't see that being granted. And I'm perhaps being desperately cynical here. I may have totally misread Keir Starmer, but I don't think so. So let's just go back to some nitty gritty, which is where Labour's going to be better, because frankly, there aren't any big visionaries there. So let's talk about some nitty gritty. What were you going to ask for if you sat down and said, do I want to control over inheritance tax, national insurance? Do I have control over investment income taxation, capital gains tax? Any of those of any interest? What would you do with them if you could get them?
So first of those, if we're talking about the phrase I used before, low-hanging fruit and then working your way up, is finish devolution of income tax, because we have non-shares and dividends income tax. It would be great if we could actually complete the package and be able to tax shares and dividends in Scotland. So we've got a coherent income tax package, not just one bit of it and the other bit of it remains reserved. So that would be first port of call. Areas like inheritance tax and capital gains, that would then be a big priority for the Scottish Greens, because we recognise that inequality in this country, yes, there's income inequality, but the real problem is wealth inequality and generational wealth inequality. And in Scotland, a lot of that is tied to land and land ownership. So that's part of the equation. But if we want to break that cycle and really redistribute wealth and power in this country, the combination of capital gains and inheritance tax would go a long way. If you did that at a national level in Scotland, and then at a local level, scrap the council tax, replace it with a land value tax, collectively, that could be genuinely transformational. It wouldn't just raise a huge amount of additional revenue, it would allow you to break up the power that a tiny number of people hold in this country by generationally gathering as much wealth and property and land as they can, and then keeping it. And that's why we've seen, not just for a couple of generations, but in many cases in Scotland, for centuries, the same families have owned huge chunks of this country. So you've got the traditional inequality of land ownership with the old lairds, and then we've got the new inequality of Danish billionaires and royal families from the rest of the world, or just PO boxes in Panama who also own big chunks of our land.
I'm aware we've got a time constraint, Ross, so I'm going to move you on a little bit. You mentioned borrowing. I don't want to spend too long on it. And it worries me because I don't want the Scottish government potentially to have too many sums borrowed in sterling on the day when independence happens, as we both think it should and will. But what do you want? What do you want on borrowing?
On borrowing, the first thing is about removing the limits. So the kind of top line is saying, in lots of ways, the Scottish government's borrowing powers are actually more limited than local councils. So the Scottish government can't do prudential borrowing, for example. So councils have greater kind of scope in their borrowing. The key thing is capital borrowing. Borrowing to cover your day-to-day spending, so your revenue or resource side of the budget, can carry more risks. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. There are compelling reasons to do it in various situations. But the key thing is to borrow to fund capital projects, because we know that that's, particularly the capital projects we want, that's going to be really good for your society, your economy, and for the planet. If you are borrowing to invest in your public transport system, borrowing to invest in housing, borrowing to improve public infrastructure, the benefits are felt by everybody. So your economy benefits, the communities benefit, the planet benefits, if in the case of public transport infrastructure, or better insulated, easier to heat homes, things like that. So if we actually were able to end the limits on capital borrowing for the Scottish government, then you could invest, particularly use that capital borrowing to invest in areas where you can be confident of the return. So things like housing, where obviously there's then going to be a return on that. If you're talking about investment for social housing, that there's obviously a rent coming back on it. So you can massively reduce the risk to the government, because all borrowing obviously carries a risk, though the last 10, 20 years have shown us a profound misunderstanding of how government borrowing works and talking up the risk too much in a lot of cases. But there is a risk. So investing in things like housing, where you've got that stable return, if the Scottish government had this silly limits on its borrowing lifted, we could do that. And over a 5-10 year period, you could see the kind of investment in our economy that we really, really need. And there would be very little risk when it comes to actually paying back on that borrowing, because you've done everything you needed to do to both directly generate a return on something like housing and indirectly to create a more prosperous and productive economy by improving things like your public transport infrastructure that is really key to our economy. And we don't talk about public transport in those economic terms nearly enough, I think.
Agreed. I agree very much with that. I was at this point going to ask you a question on the magic money tree, but frankly, you've already answered it. So I don't see the point of repeating ground we've already covered. You made your position very clear. So in the few minutes we've got left, I want to ask you a few quick questions covering a range of topics, but which I'm actually asking all the people I'm interviewing, very similar questions, because I hope they will illustrate either differences or that there's also, importantly, some commonality. The UK national debt needs repaying. The Scottish national debt would need repaying. True or false?
Trying to answer a question on debt as true or false is so difficult, because national debt is not like a family household having debt. I mean, yes, there are rules around debt and debt needs repaid, but not in the way that we think of in terms of the loan that you might take out or a mortgage that you might take out as a family. I realize I've strayed out with the true false dimension there, but talking about
everybody has.
Debt,
everybody has. Yes, you're right. And I think you brought out an incredibly important point, and I'm going to highlight it for those who are listening, watching to this interview. The national debt is nothing like a household debt. It's never been repaid. The Bank of England has set bank base rate at 5.25% at present, and nobody's talking about it in this election campaign, which has staggered me. Nobody's talking about what it should move to, which has staggered me. What's the Greens' position in Scotland on bank base rates? What would you want to do?
My default on that is to talk about, actually, I think there's a real question about the independence of the Bank of England, and actually whether
that's the next question, but you can roll them together if you like.
I'm skipping into that already. Apologies. Yes, there's a question of has Bank of England independence actually worked? When you get everybody from people on the left like me to Ed Balls to Liz Truss all saying actually we need to talk about the independence of the bank. I think there is a key question there. I don't think the bank has fulfilled its own key objectives at primarily, keeping inflation down. So that there is a question, like, it depends what kind of economy you want in terms of it, like the direction you want for interest rates, and how much you want your economy to be based on manufacture of goods and export, how much you want your economy to be based on something other than that, range of options other than that. If you want a more domestically centered economy, less export focused, or arguably more import focused, I would argue for more of a kind of resource self-sufficient economy. For us, ultimately comes back to, we wouldn't want to be as reliant on exports. We would want a more resilient economy that can cope with the global shocks that are coming to the shocks to the global economy because of things like climate breakdown. So for us, not having an economy that's so much based on external export, so you don't necessarily want your exports to be cheap. I realize
we've way beyond the yes or no here. Far off. I'm trying to keep us to time. Another quick one then. A Scottish currency for an independent Scotland as soon as possible after independence, yes or no?
Oh, yes or no. There we go. We finally got a yes or no answer out of me. Yes, absolutely. As soon as possible.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Look, easy. Land value tax. You've already given me that one. I'm going to guess your answer for you. I think that one's a yes. A wealth tax. As a wealth tax. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
So we're proposing Scottish Greens in this election, top 1%. It would be that's assets of about 3.5 million and above. It would be a 1% wealth tax, and then it would go up if you get to the top 0.1%, 0.5%, 0.1%, etc. But yeah, we need to tax wealth to tackle inequality.
And increased taxes on wealth, which is not the same as a wealth tax, but income derived from it. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, the only way that you can tackle wealth inequality in this country is by diversifying the tax base and diversifying our tax revenues, because unfortunately, the rich and powerful will always find creative ways to try and avoid tax. So you need to diversify your options, but also to recognize that tax isn't just about raising revenue. It's about changing behaviors and tackling social, environmental problems as well. So you need a whole range of levers that you can pull on to do that.
Ross, you've just put yourself in the 1%. That's the 1% of politicians who understand that point. rather than the top 1% of wealth owners necessarily. I'm not making any
I've definitely not got 3.5 million in the bank.
But you put yourself in the 1% who understand tax. Look, thank you very much. I found that interesting. I hope the listeners and viewers of this on the National's website will do so. Thanks a lot. Good luck. I know you're campaigning hard. I've been looking at your Twitter account. Thank you. And July the 4th will tell.
Thanks, Richard. Good to be with you.